Hello and welcome back. Did you know there are at least 10 different tools in Lightroom for adjusting the color in your photographs? And if you're just using the tools in the basic panel, you're missing out on a number of really effective controls that you can use to enhance your photographs. In this video, we're going to dive in and look at all of the tools available, and I'll show you the tools that I use to enhance photographs where there are problems with the color. So let's jump in and take a look. So in looking at all of these different color controls in Lightroom, what we'll do firstly is step through what all of these different color controls are, and then we'll look at a couple of examples and work through making the color adjustments. And I've got here a couple of examples of images with color problems. This first one was photographed in the Tasmanian rainforest, and it was photographed very early morning in an overcast sky, and there's quite a strong color cast in the image. The second one we'll use is one photographed in the Scottish Highlands. It's a bit underexposed, and as it is, it'll be very difficult to make an accurate assessment of the correct color in the image. So we'll go back firstly to the Tasmanian image, and let's look at the different controls we have available to us. And we'll start with the basic panel because that's where Adobe suggests you start working, and of course it's not necessarily in the right order. But if we go to the top of the basic panel, first thing we have is an area called the profile. Now you will probably by default be looking at Adobe Color or Adobe Standard as the color profile, and that represents how the color information is read from the raw file and converted into a viewable image. And there are other options, and for instance, we're photographing a landscape. Why not use the landscape profile? You can see straight away it's changed the colors somewhat, made them a little bit more vivid. Now that may or may not suit what you want, but there's one control. And secondly, moving down from the profile area, we come to the white balance controls here. Now you've got the two sliders. We can adjust the color temperature and the tint. Now, as I said, this was photographed deep in shadow with a lot of very vibrant greens, and the auto white balance has tried to compensate for that excess of green by shifting the tint well over into the magenta, which is probably not what we want. So we can adjust that backwards and forwards until we get something that is much closer to what we want. So that's our second color control. And then moving down, still within the basic panel, of course, ignoring all of the other tonal adjustments, we come down to our vibrance adjustment slider, which increases the saturation of colors that are not already highly saturated. And you'll see if I go all the way to 100, everything becomes pretty vibrant. And if I take it all the way down to 0, it doesn't take all of the color out, but it reduces it very much so. So somewhere in there, there's the correct amount of vibrance. And of course, we also have the saturation, which basically just saturates everything to 100%, which we don't want. So let's just reset those. And the next section we'll go on to is the calibration section. Now the calibration section is something that most people would probably never go and visit, but it's a really important area that we can do a lot to our image with. So if we come all the way down to the bottom, click on the calibration section, we have some adjustments here for the red, blue and green primaries. We also have a shadows tint adjustment, and within each of these primary adjustments we've got a hue change slider. Now you'll see here, for instance, if we look at the blue primary, if I shift the blue primary saturation, you would probably think that it's just going to affect the blue colors, but in fact it doesn't. If I move that blue primary slider all the way up to 100%, you'll see that it not only has affected the blues in the image, but it's also affected the greens and some of the other colors in the background. So if I push that all the way to 100%, then if we look at the hue slider, you'll see here that it's more of a move from blue to purple and from blue to cyan. So if I move that in a different way here, you'll see that it also dramatically changes the color. And by just moving that blue primary hue adjustment from blue to more of a cyan adjustment, it's totally changed the color. So these are very powerful tools. If we just reset these now, we're not going to make these adjustments now. And of course, if we go through the same thing with each of those different primaries, you'll see, yes, the green primary does certainly shift the greens in the foliage dramatically. And again, if I move that hue slider, you'll see that it makes quite a big difference. So this is just so that you're aware of the different options available. And of course, the red primary saturation, yes, if I move the red primary, I'm changing the saturation of all of this dead foliage on the floor and changing some of the other colors. So they have an effect not only on their primary channel, but also on some of the other colors. And again, if we look at the shadows hue adjustment, you'll see here that I can increase or decrease that tint in those shadow areas, which is something that we looked at in the basic panel when we were looking at our temperature and tint. And this is probably a better way to actually refine those colors. So let's just leave all these back at their default settings and move on to the next group of color adjustment tools. Now, the first two panels that we've looked at, the basic panel and the calibration panel, really represent global color adjustments to the image. So the next panel we're going to have a look at is the color mixer panel, and that deals with more specific adjustments to particular colors. Now, within the color mixer panel, we have two options. We have the color mixer, which most people would be familiar with. We have a range of different color tints, and we have the option of adjusting the hue, saturation, and the luminance. Or I could open them all up at once and we can work through them. Or you have the newer option here where you have the point color, where you can use the color probe to select a particular color and then modify its hue, saturation, and luminance specifically. Now, we're not going to make any adjustments here at this point, but we do have these other sliders here. Now, these target particular colors. For instance, most of the green areas of foliage are made up of green and yellow, and mostly yellow. So if I was to move the yellow saturation up, you'll see that that affects just those areas. And of course, if I was to go back to the reds, we already know that the reds in that foliage will be affected. So this is more of a selective way of targeting particular colors. And not to forget that we also have the hue shift area here for each of these colors. For instance, if I was looking at the green, you'll see here that if I use the hue slider on the green, it's going to move it more towards yellow or more towards aqua. And each of these colors you'll see as we step down. So if we look at the aqua slider, it moves more towards green or more towards blue. The blue slider moves more towards aqua or more towards purple, and so forth. So we have some quite powerful tools for adjusting those things, but they need to be used with caution. And finally, we have the option of adjusting the luminance values of each of these colors. And if I really wanted to make this green foliage stand out, I would start to look at the luminance of the yellow areas, and you'll see there, if I lifted that right up and with the greens, it's going to raise the brightness of all of those. And of course, we'll lose a lot of the saturation, but we could come back, and if we wanted to do this, of course, change the saturation of those to compensate, so that we would really start to see a vibrant change. Let's just turn that off so that we can see the difference. Quite a massive difference. That's way too much, but just to demonstrate what we can do there with these individual sliders. So that's yet another option for changing the color in our images. Now, the next area we're going to have a quick look at is the color grading panel. And this is one that is also, again, targeting colors, but based on the different tonal ranges. We've got the midtones, shadows, and highlights, and we have an option here with this little wheel option to look at changing the color of each of the groups of areas. Let's have a look at the shadow areas, for instance. If I wanted to cool down the shadow areas, I can move this slider around, and it definitely changes the colors in the particular tonal ranges. And we have a blending option here that determines how much we add, and then the balance of what are considered to be shadows and midtones and highlights. Now, I find this panel is a little bit tricky to use. I think that these controls, while they look fancy, they can get out of control very quickly, and I think the color grading based on luminosity, you can still do most of the other things with the other controls. But that's yet another option for working with color. Now, after just a very quick walk through all of those different color controls, you might be thinking, there's way too many options here. How do I know which ones I should use, and are all of them necessary anyway? Well, probably some of them are not really necessary, and some are a little bit redundant because they do more or less the same thing. So let's have a look at how we would approach dealing with a problem image that needs some work. So let's move over to this example from the Scottish Highlands and have a look at how we would correct the color. Now, this image is a little bit underexposed. It was photographed trying to retain detail in the highlights, and maybe I should have done an HDR here, but I didn't. So let's have a look at how we would process that. Now, Adobe firstly wants us to have a look at the color and the white balance, but how do we assess the white balance? The image is too dark, so you wouldn't even consider adjusting the white balance until you've got the exposure set at a value there where you can really assess the colors. So you'll see here that there's no blown out highlights. There are a few very minor blocked up black areas. So let's just move that slightly in, and I'll bring the highlights and the whites back down a little bit so that we want to retain as much detail as we can in those brighter areas. And then we move to what Adobe still insists on calling the exposure slider, but in fact is the midtones, and start to move the middle of the image up towards that brighter area, brighten the overall image up quite a bit. And of course we'd need to bring some of this shadow area up some more as well, so that we can really see the colors. Now that's possibly a little bit over bright, so let's just bring that back a little bit, but we can fine-tune these a little bit further on. And obviously the image is now pretty flat, so we would look at increasing the contrast a little bit. So okay, now we've got an image where we can see the colors a little better. So how would we look at adjusting the colors and the white balance? Well, I have an old building here that's in the shade. So if I used my eyedropper tool here and did the white balance from here, it's going to be too warm because that building should be a little bit cool because it's in the shade. So we would probably need to go and adjust that back a little bit. But before we really start to go too far into the white balance, we should go and look at the calibration tools and see if we can get a better balance using those tools and those options. So before we move into the calibration tools, all we've done so far is we've adjusted the tonality of the image. We've made a very minor adjustment to the white balance, and we haven't touched the vibrance or saturation, because I think a better way to go is to come down to the calibration tools and then see what they can do for us. And I've previously made some adjustments here. And firstly, if we look at the RGB primaries, I've made some adjustments here, and this is what it looks like once I've applied those adjustments. So what I've done is I've enhanced the green colors, and I've reduced some of that warmer tone in the image, and we could probably even take that down a little further and play around with this for some time. And I've just tinted the shadows a little bit, just so that we get a little bit of that magenta out of the background. And using those tools, we're getting a little bit closer. So the next thing I would do, I would go back to my color mixer panel, and I would start to look at where I would like to emphasize some of these colors. Now, this was taken in early spring. There was still quite a lot of browned off vegetation, and I'd like to try and emphasize a little more the green and the yellows in there. So if I was to go and look at the green saturation slider in the mixer panel, if I crank that all the way up, it makes a very small difference. So I can afford to really push that up quite a bit, but it's the yellow saturation obviously where it'll make a big difference. And if I really push that all the way up, it goes quite crazy. So we've just got to be a little bit careful there and just increase that a little bit. And I think I would probably even look at reducing the reds and the oranges just a little bit more, because there's a little bit of a yellowy red cast still there. And so we can go then, having looked at all of these sliders, we would go to the luminance slider, and I would like to lighten those green areas a little bit more. And you can see if I really move that slider a long way, those green grasses in this left hand side of the image really start to take life and start to lift up. Now we don't want to go too crazy, and we could probably afford to do a little bit with the greens, but we're now looking quite a bit closer to what I think should be the image. We've gotten rid of a lot of those dull shadowy areas, and we're starting to look much more like the image I imagined. So now that we've worked with the calibration panel and the mixer panel, now of course there could be more that you would do depending on the image, but let's just say that this is now looking pretty close. I would go back to my basic panel and I'll have a look and see if what I've done is looking okay. And to assess the white balance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my vibrance all the way up to 100% to see where the colors are looking. Now the sky should have a bit of blue in it. There should be some blue in the shadows here, and this building that was in shadow should also look a little bit blue. And you'll see there that there's quite a lot of yellow and green coming out. That's probably okay. Take that back to 0. Now we can start to have a look at, do we just want to brighten or enhance the overall vibrance just a little bit more? And of course I would be starting to look at things like the contrast and just refining that exposure again, just to get the right feel. Now in normal processing I would mask the sky and darken that, because that's really looking like it's wanting to start to blow out, and we could rectify that, but that's not part of this video. We're really looking at how we can then enhance the colors and make the image much more vibrant without resorting to the basic tools that you might otherwise use. So let's now have a look at the other image that I used as an example, and we'll step through that. So moving on to the other image that we worked on earlier. This is the one taken in the rainforest in Tasmania, and we can see that amongst other things it's a little bit underexposed. The colours are quite a long way off, but it's good enough for us initially to have a little bit of a stab at the white balance, and we can have a little bit of an estimate of how it should look, somewhere like that, and probably increase the overall exposure and contrast a little bit more so that we can really have a look at how the colours should look. But let's go down and have a look at the calibration panel and see how that will work for us in this image. And let's just have a look at those sliders again. If I move the blue primary all the way to the left, it goes very washed out. If I take it to the right, it goes very vibrant. But somewhere in here there's an improvement that I think is worthwhile. And then I can fine-tune that hue. I think if I move to the left towards the cyans, it starts to go very orangey. If I go too far to the right, it goes very greeny. So I think we might leave that at 0. Then let's have a look at the green primary. We know that this should be really vibrant green, and so we can push that up a little bit more. And again, with the hue slider, I can change that. It's a little bit too yellow that way. It's a little bit too green that way. Somewhere fairly close to neutral is about right. And finally, the red primary. We know that these bits of dead foliage on the ground are quite bright and vibrant. Probably not that vibrant, so we can just bring that back a little bit. And again, using our slider, we can see how that using the red primary slider and changing the hue, it makes a dramatic difference to the overall color. So we'll just take that back to 0 and then see how that looks now. If I just turn that panel off, we can see how the original image was still looking pretty flat, and now we've brought it up to looking something much more vibrant. It's possibly a little bit too vibrant, so maybe we should just bring that back a little bit and just not go too crazy. But overall, we've made a substantial improvement to the image. And now we can go back to our color mixer panel. And again, if I wanted to brighten up those mosses, I can really start to lift the luminance values. And of course, if I lift the luminance values too much, the colors get a little bit washed out. So we just have to be fairly careful with that. And the greens, yes, we don't want to go too much with the greens. We want to retain some semblance of believability. And then if we return back to our basic panel, really it's looking a lot better even without doing too much with that hue and temperature, the temperature and tint sliders, and I can just now fine-tune that a little bit so that I get the effect I'm looking for. That's possibly a little bit too much, but overall, with a problem image that has a little bit of a color cast, using the calibration tools and our color mixer, we can get very, very close to what we want. And of course, there is no right or wrong. It's all a question of what the color means to you and how you remember the appearance of the scene, and you can use these tools to achieve that. So if we stick away from the basic panel and use these other tools, we've got much more control over how the colors are represented in our image, and we can achieve a much better result. And so after looking at that image for a little while after I'd applied those steps, I realized it was a little bit too vibrant. So I reduced the vibrance a little bit using the vibrance slider here, and then applied a few more adjustments to the shadows and the blacks to give me an overall image that I'm happy with. So if we want to have a look at how the original image looked, that's what it looked like. And now we have this version that's obviously a lot more vibrant, has a much more appealing look to it. It may or may not be exactly to your taste, but with these tools we've got a lot more control over the color rather than just using the simple temperature sliders here and the vibrance tools. If we use the calibration and the mixer tools, we've got a lot more options for enhancing the color and bringing a photograph to life. So I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching.